Today, we're going to go into some common assessor challenges. I've talked about these in previous assessment-related professional development sessions. But the real core of the session that I wanted to go into today was the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence, but into action. And what do I mean by that? I think a lot of these principles of assessment and rules of evidence, as you probably know already, because you're all experienced, most of you are experienced professionals, a lot of it happens upstream at the assessment tool developer phase. And so there's a lot of things that we don't really have much control over as an assessor. So the practitioner, the person that's actually using the assessment tools to make a decision. And so many of these kind of principles of assessment and rules of evidence type sessions, including ones I've run myself, are from the perspective of designing the assessment tool. So if you're the one that gets to write the questions and write the case studies and develop the assessment checklists and the overall assessment strategies and the mapping and everything else, then that puts a huge responsibility on you, because you've got to make sure that what you write flows down to the assessors that are going to use your tool. But today we're moving away from that, and we're going, okay, what happens on the ground, on the day, at the coalface, whatever the analogy is you want to use, for the assessor who's stuck with these assessment tools and maybe doesn't have as much control over it. So what can we do? And unfortunately, there's sometimes not a lot that we can do, but we're going to look at what are the best things that we possibly can do within the principles and rules that we have. So I want to look at that more about like into action, stuff that we can actually do to try and move towards better practice, towards these principles and these rules. And then I've got a section on, well, a bit of a discussion on, well, what can we control and what can't we control? And then there's this kind of running theme that sits underneath all of this stuff. And it's more about, if you just can't go and edit your assessments and rewrite them at will. I think that becomes a bit, especially in larger teams, it becomes a bit more like a too many cooks spoil the broth type thing. But you can become an advocate for quality, someone who demonstrates leadership amongst your colleagues to try and get better practice happening amongst your team. So we'll talk about that a bit, and then some personal tips for assessors. So moving away from the compliance-y technical stuff and just going, hey, how do we feel as an assessor? What can we do better? How can we engage in better practice? So these are my objectives or things I'm going to cover today. Let's get into them. So I typically ask the question, and you're welcome to share this in chat. What are some challenges that you face as an assessor? And I know I've asked this, if anyone's been to previous sessions, I've asked this question before, but what are some challenges that you face as an assessor? I'll go through some of these things on the screen, but I might just have a quick look in the chat and see if anyone's telling me about their challenges. What challenges do you face? Disengagement, Donna, in online. Time challenges. Another one for disengagement, use of AI in answering questions. How flexible to be in the moment, Peter? Yeah, thank you. Lack of communication from the learners. Thanks, Dale. Definitely AI, ChatGPT, yeah, lots of that. Wow, yeah, big AI, unmotivated students. I missed some really good ones. Okay, it's going, yes, you got some really great ideas here. Loving this. Oh, I'm sorry, I can't even keep up. Language issues with students with English as a second language. Yep. Caitlin, you've said students assuming because they enroll, they will automatically pass. Yes, they've got to do the work, don't they? Okay, Mark, plagiarism, Edward, yes, thank you. Pressure, Shaman, you've said, hello, Shaman, nice to see you here. Pressure to find everyone competent, yes. Oh, this is so good. LLN, amazing. Thank you so much for your contribution. I love this. Here's some things, some common because I've asked this question a lot, and as you probably have seen in previous sessions and in TA groups and communities of practice that I'm involved in, and I feel like these ones here, they're really in line with what you were saying as well, and you've added a few other things. I probably could have added AI and predicted that one. The big challenge is when you get asked to observe the unobservable or ask the unanswerable. What do I mean by that? It's sometimes poorly written assessments have these observation checklists that have these criteria written in them that it's something that you can't really see. It's been a copy and paste from the unit, and you kind of look at it and your eyes cross over a little bit and you think, well, how do I actually observe that? Or there might be a question that is not easy for the students to answer or doesn't match the marking guide. Another one is observation checklists with expectations that are not in the instructions. So the students get a set of instructions that tells them to go and do A, B, and C, but then your observation checklist has A, B, and C, and then D, E, F, G, H, and all these other things. And there's this problem because you think, wow, I'm now faced with this challenge where I've got to, I suppose if I'm to follow the rules, every student who's done this assessment is going to get not yet satisfactory. And it's not really their fault because the instructions that they were given only covered A, B, C. So that can be a common problem. Another one is the marking guide or model answer with expectations that aren't in the question. So that might be, the model answers, you don't really give them to the students. That's the secret stuff that only assessors get to see, but it might list all these things and the question doesn't actually ask that. And so again, it puts you in that really difficult position. Do I follow the marking guide and every student doesn't successfully complete the assessment? Or do I kind of make up my own answer based on what I'm seeing the students do here? It might be a bad mood. Sometimes we get in a bad mood. We're just grumpy and we decide that maybe that's maybe influencing our decision. We might dislike or feel frustrated with a student. On the other side of things, some of us get into have this kind of people-pleasing thing. It's hard to say no, and we want our students to like us. Of course, we want to, it's very human to want to be liked. We don't want to be disliked. And so when you've got to give bad news and tell a student that maybe they've got to do an assessment again, we fear that. And that can really influence the decision we make. We might fear getting bad course feedback if there's any kind of performance job stuff tied in with, what the students think of us. And you might be worried about getting bad feedback. And so you want to make them happy. We could be just tired over it, the 37th assessment for the day, lack of time. That was something that was mentioned in the chat quite a few times, wanting to paint a positive picture for audit. So you kind of want to dress everything up so it looks good, knowing that it might be scrutinized during a validation session. And funding pressures is another one that comes up. So there's a lot of funding models that are kind of based on the success of students getting through the course. And you might have a manager or someone that says, hey, if you don't pass 80 or 90% of these students, then we might not get funding next time. So you have to make sure they finish. And so you start feeling these pressures to push them through. So I think these challenges, a lot of us can relate to them and they're very real. I'm really loving the chat between you as well, and especially since I can't stay focused too much on the chat for this session. So feel free to kind of talk amongst yourselves and share ideas. I just know so many of you are really showing leadership in VET. So there's a lot of really amazing people in the session today. So share your ideas freely and discuss and chat and connect. I love that. All right, so I think we've set the scene here that the job of the assessor, even on a good day, even when you have excellent quality assessment tools, is still pretty challenging. So let's get into the principles of assessment and rules of evidence. But before we do that, I thought I'd do a little bit of a brief history lesson. So this is going back well over 30 years, because it's quite good to think about where does this stuff come from? So much of this policy, and at the moment we're talking about another set of standards that are coming out in July. But where did all this national standardization for vet come from? Well, there's this thing called NFROT in 1992, which was the first time they brought together vet as this sort of nationally cohesive, nationally consistent system in Australia in 1992. So this is the first mention of something that resembles the principles of assessment and somewhat the rules of evidence as a kind of a way of getting all the assessors in Australia that work in the vet system to come together. And so this was kind of like the first national mention of it. There's certainly research that goes back even further into validity in assessment and that sort of thing, which is very, very interesting. But this is kind of where it all started. I think it's great to look into this stuff. You can research these sorts of things through NCVER, and they've got a really great library of research and all sorts of documentation from 30 plus years ago. And I think this is really good because we can easily get in this space of kind of parroting, and even the current policymakers are sort of, well, this is what we talk about. Assessments have to be valid. But this gives some real context and background as to, well, what were the early people behind the vet system? What were they thinking? What was their reasoning for wanting assessments to be valid? What was it like before we had a national system of vet, when things maybe weren't so valid? What sort of system did we have then? So it's I think we can learn a lot from looking at history. So a bit of a blast from the past there. So in this NFROT, there was 5 assessment principles that were written into it that resemble our principles now. And I'll actually mention, I'm going to put a few of these throughout the session just to kind of give you a bit of context and just to see how not much has changed in 4 years. So here's our first one, validity. So I've aligned this to the new standards for RTOs, the draft. I guess they're pretty much locked in now and rolling out in July. So I didn't want to give you stale information, but the good thing is they're pretty much the same as the 2015 standards, so not too much has changed, but there are a few subtle differences. And I thought it'd be interesting to compare it to the old the principles that were in the NFROT from 33 years ago now. So what do the new standards say about validity? Under the principles of assessment, they say that assessment of skills and knowledge is integrated with practical application and would enable the vet student to demonstrate these skills and knowledge in similar situations. What did it say in our similar national vet policy document back then? Under validity, they said assessment methods must actually measure what they say they measure. That's a direct quote from that document, which was released in August 1992. So there's not too much change. They've just kind of fluffed up and fancied up the language a little bit more. What does this mean in simple terms? It means we need to assess both skills and knowledge, not just knowledge, not just skills. We need to ensure we integrate that assessment of knowledge and skills with practical application. So we can't just assess knowledge and skills in isolation. We need to actually see that being used to solve problems, to do jobs, to get stuff done. And we need to also ensure the student can demonstrate those skills and that knowledge in similar situations. So if I was to translate into some simple terms, when I've deemed you competent and you get your certificate, I need to be confident that you could do it again in the workplace, because I'm not your assessor and I'm not your trainer anymore. I can't watch over you. I can't guide you and coach you and support you. You now have a certificate from my RTO that says you can do this under a nationally endorsed, nationally agreed system. So I need to be confident that when you're out on your own, that you can do it. That's the kind of, so I'm saying when I've deemed you competent, this is you're in a monologue, in a dialogue going on here. So you're thinking about this. If you're trying to think of how do I internalize the meaning of validity, you're really saying to yourself about your students, when I've deemed you competent, I need to be confident you could do it again in the workplace. So I'd like to hear from you. I think it's always good to flip these around and look at the behind them and go, well, what causes invalid assessment? You tell me in the chat, what might be some of the causes of invalid assessment? Okay, wrong practice, outdated course materials, not assessing practical skills. Good, thanks, Michelle. Yep, a couple of things on outdated, not integrating skills and knowledge. Yeah. Okay, only using role play. Online observations can be problematic. Doesn't validate the knowledge and skills, gap between knowledge and skills. There's a few mentions of that kind of separation between knowledge and skills when you're only assessing knowledge in isolation, but not attaching that to how that, because really there's knowledge and there's the theory stuff, but it's only really important when they actually start to use that to get the job done, to perform the competency, to be good at the job, to be safe in the job. Yeah, a few mentions of the challenges around validity with online, not meeting the assessment conditions. Yeah, that's good. Okay, so there's now been a couple of mentions of that. You know, whether it actually maps to the unit, does it meet the stuff that's in the unit? Someone mentioned contextualization too. Really great stuff. Please read through that, what's happening in the chat, because you all are on the right track there. So what causes invalid assessment? I think you got some good ideas. I would boil it down to these key points here. Probably the chief cause of invalidity is that the tool doesn't meet all the unit requirements. We all groan and roll our eyes at the prospect of having to map from a unit of competency to an assessment tool. But there's a reason we do mapping, and that is to make sure that validity is actually happening. But again, that's not really something that we can control as an assessor, is it? Like, especially if we're just handed the assessment tool and we're not permitted to edit it or anything, we can't really do that. But that's probably the chief issue. The tasks don't reflect the challenges of the real work environment. So it's kind of like, yeah, you could probably argue that it's mapped across to the unit in some way or another, but it doesn't. What I'm asking the students to do is, as someone mentioned in the chat, probably a couple of people mentioned that, you know, the role play is not realistic. It doesn't really reflect how challenging it is to do this job in the real world. Or what about when students are given support beyond what they get on the job? And I put in there well-meaning, you know, we're often taught in some of the language literacy and numeracy units of the TAE and other training that, you know, we've got to provide support to students. That we absolutely do. It's a very, very important part of people, you know, getting support. But when it comes to the assessment side of things, the training has finished. So we hope that by now we've been able to remove the supports. That's why we use that term scaffolding. Like when the building is finished, the scaffolding comes down and those supports aren't there anymore. So it's time for the student to perform to the level of that would be expected of them on the job. And so when giving support during assessment, I think a really good way of checking that is thinking, well, you know, what support would they have on the job? You know, are they under a lot of is it a sort of a lower level job where they've got a lot of supervision, and they might have a manager, or they're working with someone who can help, someone more experienced who can help them out. So make sure that whatever support is there kind of reflects the demands of the job. Students imitating the trainer rather than applying skills to real situations independently. So if I'm doing a thing and you're just imitating me while I'm doing it, I could say, well, you've performed the task, and I might be able to feel like I can, under a technicality, tick the box because I've seen you do that thing. But again, will they have an experienced person to imitate on the job? Probably not. They need to be able to use those skills themselves independently in real situations. Another challenge is unclear or ambiguous assessment criteria, and that leaves the assessor and their own whims. We just already talked about that big list of stuff that can, how we feel as an assessor, how, sometimes we're tired, sometimes we're grumpy. And, so we don't want to try and let too much of that leak into our assessment decisions. They're very important decisions to be making. So the unclear or ambiguous assessment criteria can be problematic. And over-reliance on inappropriate assessment methods. So if we're relying on, say, written responses to something that is inherently skills-based, that can be a problem as well. That can lead to invalidity. So into action. What can we do? And again, I'm making the assumption that most of us are not the assessment tool developer, that we don't have the job of actually writing the assessment tools. Some of you may, which is good. But what does the average assessor have? What can they do? So, well, our job is to follow the instructions, to follow the marking guides, to follow the checklists and the procedures that are given to us from the RTO. But then some of you might say, well, I really think the assessments our RTO is using are lacking. I see glaring holes in these procedures or in these checklists, or the marking guides are not accurate. Some of the issues I talked about on the previous screen. So what do? Well, your RTO will likely have a process in place for getting these assessment tools changed. So know what that is, find out what that is, find out how you go about approaching the right person to have changes made, or at least advocate for changes. And I'll mention that calibration thing in just a moment, but you can see at the bottom there, I've said, I suggest the idea of advocacy and leadership. So what does that mean? It means that you're someone who is proactive in fostering an environment where we want good quality assessment tools, we want valid assessment tools, that that you might be able to suggest new ways of wording things, not just come to someone with a problem and whinge and complain that it's wrong, but actually, look, what solutions can I bring here? Not always easy. I understand some organizations' cultures might not really foster that kind of environment, but what can you do within your area of control that allows you to do that? And I've also mentioned here a calibration exercise. So when you're starting out assessing with a new unit or assessment tool in particular, calibrating your understanding of the unit can be really, really helpful, and calibrating your understanding of the job. So I have a little template that you can use. Just give me a moment, please, and I'll share that with you. Into the chat. And here we go. Coming across now. So this is the link to a template that you can use, and I'll include this in the follow-up email that I send to everyone as well, so you can access that. So this is just something. This is not an official tool or anything like that, but it's something that I made up, which is quite helpful in if you're just starting out. It just helps you kind of align the job, the real workplace, with the unit of competency, and of course build your understanding. So it can be helpful, or something like that. Feel free to use it, adapt it, do what you want with it. Or sometimes I just find an on paper with the old texters and pens to be a lot more helpful than writing it on paper. So sorry, to be on paper is a lot more helpful than writing it on a computer. You know what I mean? So the next one is reliability. So the new standards, what do they say? They say that assessment evidence needs to be interpreted consistently by assessors, and the outcomes of the assessment are comparable irrespective of the assessor conducting the assessment. Wow, the wording's a little bit, it takes a little bit of unpacking some of this wording of the new standards. What did the old standards, this is not the 2015 one, but the ones from the very first set of standards that came out in 1992, they actually had a principle on reliability too. And they said This means that any trained assessor would reach the same conclusion about a person's achievement of a particular competency. That's pretty good. I like that one. Now, I'm taking all of these things and trying to put them into, these are my simple terms too, by the way. So it's just my interpretation. That's all I can offer you. So my interpretation of reliability, looking at it through the lens of these new standards, is that we need to interpret evidence consistently with other assessors. In simple terms, if I find you competent, she would also find you competent. If she found you not yet competent, so would I. What causes unreliability in assessment? Tell me in the chat. Okay, here we go. Favoritism, personal perspectives, bias, fatigue, differing opinions. Thank you, Amanda. Unclear marking guidelines, Annika. Yes, agree. Outdated guidelines, lack of knowledge of the unit that's being assessed, Sharon, definitely. Cheating, trainer bias. Lots of mention of bias, different views, poor benchmarks. Would depend on what each assessor thinks. G'day, Trev. Language use, perspective, unclear questions, beautiful. Okay, you're definitely on the right track. I can't even keep up with that. Oh, I saw something really good there. Nancy, you've said, hi, Nancy, nice to see you here. The 2015 standards, these rules align with principles of evidence commonly found in legal frameworks, such as the Evidence Act of 1995. The new rules create ambiguity. Okay, thank you. All right, that's a great conversation there. You can keep an eye on that because there's some really good perspectives coming through on the chat. Just boiling it down to 7 or so points that I find on reliability is subjectivity in assessor judgments, external pressures, influences, time constraints, lack of evidence on which to form judgment. So it might be that the assessment process you're given from your RTO doesn't create enough performances by the student that you can form a confident judgment. Assessor biases, as you've all mentioned, very good. Inconsistent contexts, especially in the workplace. So it might be that you're assessing some kind of unit that has some aspects of things that could go wrong, and you're doing a workplace assessment, but the workplace is really calm that day. It's not very busy, it's not very chaotic. And so you can't really assess how that student works under pressure or something. Vague criteria, unobservable criteria, lack of collaboration, and moderation. So this can be interesting with reliability, is when assessors just aren't talking to each other. Sometimes that lunchroom, staff room kind of, or I guess if you're an online dispersed business, you know, the Slack chat on your different chat apps or teams, where you get together and talk to each other, can be such a really fantastic opportunity to build reliability because you're coming to a common understanding. We do it so much, like, you know, we do TAE, so it's such a challenging qualification. And so we want to be able to ensure that we all understand what a task is expecting someone to do, what sort of performance we expect from the students. Sure, it's written into the assessor guides and the marking guides and things like that, but what do we understand of that? How do we make sure that there's consistency there? So those conversations can be really, really effective in building reliability beyond just what's written into the assessment tool. So here's some I'll just put up some examples here of these common challenges. You've probably seen this type of thing before. So here's a question. Identify and briefly describe 3 types of maps or charts. Okay, I look at that and I go, okay, that's a reasonable question. But then the marking guide says the answer must include, and then it goes on to list 5 points of maps or charts. And so something like this, which is a pretty easy, I mean, probably the word must is what's caused the issue here. but we can immediately see this would be a field day for ASQA to find something like this, because the assessor is bound by what's said here. The marking guide says it must include 5 things, but the student's being instructed to only give 3 things. It's not the student's fault. And it's kind of not really the assessor's fault either, unless they're the ones that wrote it. It puts both the students and the assessor in a really difficult situation. All right, so into action. So I wanted to, again, just look behind these things to see how we can actually put these into practice. So follow the assessor instructions, the marking guides, checklists, and RTO procedures. This feels a bit funny saying that after kind of giving an example like that, because you say, well, what if that's what I've got to work with? That's why this third point here and some of these other points, like familiarizing yourself with your RTO's moderation process, is really, really important, because these are your opportunities to build understanding amongst assessors and to raise items for improvement. Establish consistency and standardization around the assessment tool and the process. So you might not be able to change the words in there, but can you, again, with advocacy and leadership, build consistency and understanding amongst your team? So it could be you might put together some supporting documents or some guidance information that goes to both assessors or students, if that's appropriate. Moderation's a really great activity. We've tried to make our moderation process for our RTO as easy as possible for the assessors to access, so that it's just boom. Well, you want to do a moderation, we've got a little bot. They just type in a couple of letters and boom, there's a moderation form ready to go. You jump on Zoom or whatever and have a chat or meet together, and it's just really quick and easy, because we want it to be, because we want lots of moderation to happen. Understand how to raise and action improvements. So what's the process to actually get stuff fixed? Informal moderation is really good too. So I mentioned briefly about, the formal moderation that you might document and run through the usual process, but what about the informal moderation? Where you kind of get another, hey, Fred, come on, I'm looking at this performance here that this student's done, and this happened and that happened. What do you do? What's your thoughts? That kind of informal moderation can be really great, a really great calibrator. Getting together with other assessors and industry professionals to discuss interpretations is good, and documenting them. And of course, that advocacy and leadership. What can you do to advocate for good, reliable practice in assessment? A little word of caution here. I really love, this is a really good set of guidelines. It's probably more so for higher education, from Dr. Claire Hughes, the University of Queensland, Australia. And Claire writes that assessment checklists can rarely carry all the detail of the explicit and implicit understandings and skills. Attempting to achieve levels of precision that remove all subjectivity from assessment judgments of complex learning will result in documents made unwieldy and therefore unfit for purpose through their length and obtuseness. And I think many of us have experienced that when the list of criteria in, say, an observation checklist is so long that it's a real battle to get through it. It could be repetitive. It might have, copy and paste from the performance criteria. It's all really, really challenging to work through. So just a little bit of a note there from Dr. Claire Hughes that I thought I'd put in there, so we can go too far the other way in trying to iron out every possible bias to the point where we end up with a problem in the other direction. And Sharon's, and I'm not even going to try to answer this question, but it's a really great question that I'll just kind of put out there for consideration. Sharon says, how do you achieve balance from a compliance point of view? Shaman, you said you saw a one-page observation checklist that had 20 pages of explanatory notes about each criterion. That could be problematic, Shaman. Thank you. Fairness. Let's talk about fairness. The new standards say that assessment takes into account vet student needs, including through applying adjustments where appropriate, and enabling reassessment if necessary. So that's what the new standards say. I don't think fairness was in the old NFROP document, so little to compare it to from back in the day, but let's look at what it means in simple terms. Again, my perspective is that this principle of fairness means we must consider our students' needs, we must apply adjustments where appropriate, and we must enable reassessment if necessary. So some simple terminology to consider it. What would it feel like to be assessed by me using these tools? That's a really useful thing to think about. What's it like to be my student when I'm doing the assessments? So putting these things into action. Invest time in the student, ensuring the student understands what's expected prior to assessment. I covered this in a lot of detail in an earlier session last year, actually, where we really talked about the investment and the return on investment of a really thorough briefing prior to doing something like an observation checklist. An observation assessment. And that investment really pays off because you end up with way more confidence. The students are a lot more confident when they walk into the assessment. They feel like, okay, I feel like I've been treated fairly and I understand what's expected of me. And it reduces the necessity for reassessment. So there might be that kind of pushback, like I haven't got enough time to really spend ages going into all the details of this assessment and explaining it to students up front. But what causes more time challenges is when you've got students who need to go and redo that assessment because they didn't meet the requirements, because they didn't understand. So if you can really put a lot of upfront investment in that, you will save time downstream. Make sure students agree to being assessed in accordance with whatever the instructions and processes you have. Make adjustments if appropriate. Only make reasonable adjustments and ensure the adjustments don't compromise the integrity or validity of the unit. So sometimes in this pursuit, you can see in that little graphic there, I've got this kind of tug of war happening where one person's going, I need to be fair, so I need to make adjustments. But if we start, pursuing that fairness and adjusting things too much, we start to, validity starts to lose the tug of war competition. And likewise, if we're trying to be too strict and by the rules, we might miss it. We might lose out on fairness. So it's a bit of a juggling act. A really great resource is, you might remember our special guest last year, we had Darlene McLennan from ADSET coming in, and she talked about the ADSET Reasonable Adjustments Guide. If you give me a moment, I'll just share that with you, a quick link to that document. So there's a link to the ADSET Reasonable Adjustments Guide. It's really, really awesome set of guidelines with some examples on how to do reasonable adjustments. I've also included in there, because I mentioned it previously, but a link to a moderation template that we use, which you're welcome to use and adapt. Okay, so a question for you about, we're just going to do some little case studies here, reasonable or unreasonable. So a bit of an example. In a Diploma of Leadership and Management, there's a unit called Lead Difficult Conversations. Students typically participate in several difficult conversations replicating the demands of the workplace. Good. A student was unable to attend due to hospitalisation for 2 weeks, and the assessor allowed that student to submit a written transcript of a difficult conversation from his hospital bed. Is that reasonable or unreasonable? Interesting. Oh, okay. That's very interesting to see lots of reasonables happening here. Okay, I'm gonna have to get in here and disagree. I'm sorry. I would say this is an unreasonable. Now, of course, don't feel bad if you said that, because I'm putting this thing on here with a very simple case study on the screen. But if you go and look at the unit, and you didn't have time to do that, so I don't blame you, but it's very, very clear that this unit is about leading difficult conversations, like proper face-to-face conversations. And to submit a written transcript of a difficult conversation does not capture the reality of what it's like to have a difficult conversation with a person. The person, I feel bad that they're having, it's not great that they're in hospital, but they've got time to sit there and think about what they're going to say and write it all out. That's not enough to base their assessment decision on. What about this one? Operate a forklift. Students are observed operating a forklift under a range of conditions. One student books in for the assessment but shows up with a broken wrist in a cast and is unable to safely operate the machine. The assessor assists them to book into another assessment day in the future when the student knows her wrist is likely to be out of the cast and fully functional. Is that reasonable or unreasonable? Okay, reasonable, reasonable, reasonable. Okay, good, good, good. Very good. That is reasonable. I agree. Here's one from my world. Facilitate vocational training from the TAE course. Students must be observed delivering 3 30-minute training sessions with a group of 4 students. That's written into the unit. You can't escape that no matter where you do the course. One student expresses severe anxiety about delivering the training in front of an audience. So the assessor allows them to deliver the training to an empty room with just the assessor in attendance. Is that a reasonable or unreasonable adjustment? Okay, lots of unreasonables going on here. Thank you. Okay, it is unreasonable. It's unreasonable because it violates the performance evidence. So in that unit, it says they have to do the training with 4 students present. So not having the 4 students present, this is our pursuit of well-intentioned, reasonable adjustments, but it's causing problems with one of the earlier principles of validity. A single parent with young children faces unexpected childcare challenges on the day of a scheduled practical assessment. They are prepared for the assessment but unable to attend in person due to their caring responsibilities. The assessor arranges for the assessment to take place a week later. Reasonable or unreasonable? Yep, I can say good, good, good. Reasonable, reasonable, very good. Okay, you get it. So hopefully these examples kind of set the scene for what's reasonable and what's unreasonable. But again, the ADSET guide is really, really good. Oh, I had another example. I forgot all about it. Okay, really quickly, because I'm very conscious of time. This is one on basic methods of cookery. Students get assessed at the college's commercial kitchen preparing food for real customers. So it's a college, but people can come in and dine. So they have real customers. So it gives them the real life challenge. One student is floundering and unable to complete the dishes in time for the customers during the busy lunchtime rush. The student reports to the assessor that they're feeling really stressed. The assessor gives them time to relax and allows them to come back and complete several dishes at a more leisurely pace in the afternoon after the busy lunchtime rush when it's less hectic. Oh, is a mix? No, mostly unreasonable. Okay, yeah, mostly unreasonable. Good. I agree. It's unreasonable. And again, if you said reasonable, that's okay because you didn't look at the unit. Now, the unit is actually really clear. It says this has got to fit with the demands of a real workplace. And I actually have never worked in hospitality, but sometimes I peek into the kitchen of a restaurant and it's hectic in there. It's really hectic. And so people, to be competent, to be able to get a job in that industry, they need to be able to keep up with that. Okay, that's all of my examples. A quick comparison here on flexibility. So one of the principles of assessment is flexibility. I've got on the left-hand side the new standards, and on the right-hand side the standards, the last set of standards or the current ones that we're working with. And you can see the kind of difference in wording there. I've kind of highlighted them a little bit to look at the similarities. The main difference that I found between them is that they changed the wording from flexible to, and they changed it to appropriate to. So it went from saying assessment is flexible to the individual learner, whereas the new one says assessment is appropriate to the context training product and vet student. and assesses skills and knowledge held by the vet student, irrespective of how or where they've been acquired. It's kind of I think this one's actually a bit of a simplification of it and makes a bit more sense. The other one made sense to me as well. But here we are on flexibility. Let's talk about it. Let's unpack it. It's appropriate to the context. What does that mean? That it reflects the workplace. That it's appropriate to the unit. It's got to be valid. It's appropriate to the student. It's got to be flexible. And it doesn't matter how or where the skills and knowledge have been acquired, meaning, okay, we've got to be able to offer them recognition of prior learning. In simple-ish terms, in the most simple terms I can possibly muster up, while honouring the realities of the job and the unit, try to meet the students' needs and give them an opportunity to be assessed regardless of how they learnt it. Now, we'll just dive into the rules of evidence quickly. So the standards, the new standards say that assessors make individual assessment adjustments that are justified based on the following rules. Validity. The assessment evidence assures the assessor that the vet student has the skills and knowledge described in the training product. Sufficiency. The quality, quantity, and relevance of the evidence enables a judgment of competency to be made. Authenticity. The assessment evidence presented is the vet student's own work. And currency. That the evidence demonstrates the current skills and knowledge of the vet student. Not too much of a change from the old ones. So this is back to the term validity again, just like in the principles of assessment, but through the lens of evidence now. So it says that we need to be assured that the student has the skills and knowledge described in the unit. In simple terms, am I assured that what I'm observing or hearing confirms that they have the skills and knowledge listed in the unit of competency? That's the simplest way that we can put validity through the lens of the rules of evidence. Okay, some examples of invalid evidence. Evidence that violates other rules, so it's not sufficient, not current, not authentic. Good evidence that's just not relevant. So sometimes you get really great stuff, but it just doesn't, it's not really a match with the unit, it's a bit left of field. Only supplementary or indirect evidence, so that over-reliance on third-party reports or over-reliance on asking students to explain how they would do something and answer questions about how they would solve a problem. That doesn't really show you true competence. Doesn't address all requirements of the unit, based on non-industry standard practices, and based on work done overseas, where this is not to discount any work done overseas, but where the regulatory requirements, industry practices are significantly different. Sufficiency. That refers to the quality, quantity, and relevance of the evidence, and that it enables a judgment of competency to be made. In simple terms, do I have enough? Do I have enough good quality, relevant evidence to feel comfortable making my decision? Sometimes assessors are put in these positions where maybe the assessment's pretty good, but it's just not enough. I've seen them do it once and they did a really good job, but I'm not certain that if the challenge was increased or if it was a different situation, would they still be able to perform? That can be, that word, you know, do I feel comfortable making this decision, or does it feel a bit, I'm not quite comfortable with that. So examples of insufficient evidence is that the student's doing something once, but the performance evidence requires it 3 times. Assessing only evidence of knowledge. It might be over-reliance on third-party evidence. Asking students to tell you how they would do something, but not actually getting them to do it. Students submitting a project task and trying to infer observable behaviours from it. That's a really common one that happens, is the assessment tool developer, in their haste to cover all the performance criteria, they stuff it all into a project task, but it's really, it's required, you've got to see them do it. And you're leaving the assessors with the challenging job of kind of guessing that because they wrote that thing or because they produced that outcome, that means they did it or they did it properly. It'd be really difficult. Currency. Okay, I think that's a pretty obvious one. Just means, does it represent what the student knows and can do today? So there's an example of a non-current evidence of work safely at heights, a unit of competency. I don't think this gentleman pictured would have current evidence of working safely at heights. So really, it's about currency becomes a real challenge in RPL. So someone who comes to you and says, hey, I was a really big deal in the 90s. But then I had a completely different career change. So it doesn't mean because they did stuff in the 90s that it's not relevant, but they've got to have kept that current over time. So they might provide an impressively detailed and illustrious portfolio of evidence from that era, but they haven't shown you anything from the recent times or using out-of-date equipment and practices. So that's currency. And authenticity. So this is the millions of responses there about AI and ChatGPT is a big one. Authenticity is really, really important. Oh, this one's amazing. I don't know if you've tried this, but you Google insert unit of competency code here, assignment answers, and you can buy them or even sometimes find them for free. And there's places like doing a special 50% off. And you can pay someone to do your assignment for you, and they're probably going to use ChatGPT to answer the questions as well. So these services are really abundant and prolific. So you've got to ask yourself, did the student named actually produce this? Really, in vet, at least all of us vet professionals say, well, we're lucky in vet. We don't really have to worry too much about AI and this kind of, the buying your assessments, because it's vet. It's all practical. We do all observations, but of course, that's a problem if we're over-relying on assessment methods that don't really address the unit requirements. No surprises in this. You've got to watch out for fraudulent certificates and statements of attainment too when doing credit transfers. So make sure you use the USI transcript verification service, or just take the time to go and verify it with the issuing RTO. So what can we control? I just thought I'd create this continuum. Now, where these words exist on the screen is going to be different for some of you. This is not everyone's picture. And feel free to mentally rearrange this for yourself. But I've got here a continuum. On the left-hand side is less control, and on the right-hand side is more control. For you, I want you to reflect on, well, what in my RTO, in my context, what stuff can I control? What do I have control over, and what do I not have control over? And so that you can double your efforts down on the things that you can control, and stop. Maybe, we don't want to end up in complaining about things that we can't change. But what can you do about it? So over here, most of us, and some of us get to be on committees with the different training package developers that are out there, and we can be involved in that. But even that feels very slow moving. It's kind of like being stuck in a vat of honey or something. It's like you can be involved in the consultation, but there's probably 20 other people who have differing perspectives, and you may not still have your ideas heard or included. So most of us don't have much control over what's in the training package. A lot of us don't have control over what's in the assessment tool. A lot of us may not have control over our workload or our task instructions. But moving over to the right-hand side here, yeah, we might be able to control the quality of our training, or how we prepare for assessments, or how we prepare students for assessments, how we brief them, the instructions, like what additional information can we give them that might supplement and improve that assessment process. We can control things like boundaries and our self-care. We can control things like how much we know about the unit. We can improve our professional development, our education. So for you, consider where you sit on this picture. What does this picture look like for you? And I've been harping on about this concept of advocacy and ownership and leadership and that sort of thing. So this is about going, what avenues do I have to actually influence control over some of these points on this screen here? So some of these things more over on the left-hand side, how can I move closer to them? What influence can I exert over them? But I'd ask myself the question, Am I the type of person that complains and whinges about how bad everything is, but takes no steps to improve it? Am I the type of person that just brings problems, but no solutions to managers? Or am I the type of person that takes active steps to improve the assessment tool in line with the RTO's processes? Am I the type of person that demonstrates leadership, that tries to affect this kind of positive vibe over the rest of the team, that tries to say, hey guys, let's get together and talk about this. Let's all come together and maybe reword some of these things and suggest that to the compliance manager. And for you compliance managers that are present today, what do you do? How can you reduce friction in your RTO's quality improvement processes? How can you make it easier for people to feed change suggestions into the system? If it's locked away somewhere and hard to access, then people won't make suggestions for improvements. So that's all we have time for today. We've gone through some common challenges. We've took a deep dive into the principles of assessment. We looked at the rules of evidence. We looked at what we can control and what we can't control. And I really tried to implore you to become an advocate for quality. Now, I didn't get to show you my 10 personal tips for assessors. However, these are a really great list of tips that I think you'll be able to read and understand when you look at the materials. The recording will go live on our website along with the slides and a certificate of attendance for those of you who stuck around for the main session. Apologies for my slight lack of time management today. I really had so much that I wanted to share with you, but the main thing I missed there was the 10 personal tips for assessors, and I'll share that with you in the follow-up email. Thank you so much for sharing your time with me today. I really appreciate it. Now I'll let you get back to being really amazing assessors. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in our next session.